Well, our journey is almost over. We began, if you'll recall, with a visit to the waters of Mara. Since then, we've learned some valuable lessons about spiritual maturity. We studied purging, provision, obedience, authority, changed appetites, restoration, the call of God, hospitality, the living commandments, and the pilgrims. Now, today, I want you to come with me to a desert oasis in the northern Sinai, a place called Kadesh, Barnea. It was there, after a year and a half of wandering, that the children of Israel came before their final push. But something happened at Kadesh, something tragic. Instead of pushing on in to possess the land that God had given them, they had to wander in the desert for another 38 years until all the grumblers and complainers, all those without faith, had died. I sat one day beside a small palm tree at Kadesh. It was my last journey into the Sinai. I taught a little lesson about faith. I want to share that lesson with you now, in hopes it will stimulate you as you broaden your study in the lesson period today, as you broaden your study in life as well. It's 11 days from Mount Sinai to this beautiful little oasis here at Kadesh, Barnea. We're in the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula. Here, God intended for the children of Israel to regroup, to feed their flocks, and then to go in and take the land that He had promised to them. In fact, from this place, you can literally see the borders of the Promised Land. Moses, however, was approached by a delegation of people from the people, a group who came to him and said, "Don't you think it would be a good idea if we sent some spies into the land before we go across to take it?" Now, watch out for good ideas. This was not part of God's original plan. God intended for the people to march forward under the cloud, under the anointing, and take the land. They'd already come 400 miles in 15 months. Surely they had learned by now that God was faithful and could be trusted, that if He asked them to do anything, He would also provide the means to accomplish that which He asked. But instead of moving out with the morning's light, the people hesitated. It was the first step toward unbelief. You see, instead of acting by faith and believing God, they grew cautious. They were afraid there would be giants in the land, or walled cities, or obstacles too great for them to overcome. Well, sure enough, they received what they confessed, and the negative faith brought about their downfall. You know, faith marches ahead when God speaks. But the Israelites were not able to enter the Promised Land because of their unbelief. They sent their spies in, 12 spies, one from each tribe. Of these, we know the names of only 2. Caleb, who wholly followed the Lord, and Joshua, who was called the minister of Moses. The spies left this place during the end of July, made a long route up through the Promised Land, coming back down through the Negev Desert, stopping at Hebron. Someplace along the way in one of the valleys, they cut a bunch of grapes that was so heavy, it took 2 men to carry it, slung on a staff over their shoulders. They gathered pomegranates and figs and brought them back, and after about 40 days, they returned to the camp, and there they showed all of their wares. But there was a negative report. Only Joshua and Caleb were positive. The majority of the spies said, "We can't do it. Sure, the land flows with milk and honey, but you ought to see the people who live there. My goodness, and the cities are fortified, and the folks look like the descendants of Anak, the giants. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same in their eyes as well." You know, people love to hear a negative report. The human heart loves to be deceived. It loves to rebel against God. It's the nature of man to be careful, to be faithless. The spies looked and saw themselves as grasshoppers. Joshua and Caleb look at God, and they saw that they could overcome. The people, however, sided with the negative report. The obstacles were too great to overcome. But in their decision, they made a fatal mistake. Unbelief never sees beyond the difficulties. It always looks at the walled cities and the giants rather than looking at God. Faith looks at God. Unbelief looks at obstacles. Now, faith does not minimize the danger of the difficulties, but it says God is big enough to overcome it. The people, however, looked inward. They saw themselves as grasshoppers. They tried to imagine how the giants saw them, and they saw more grasshoppers. They failed to do the one thing that Joshua and Caleb did. They looked at God. The results were tragic. God told them, you're going to remain in this area for 38 years until the whole generation of you dies, until every faithless man and woman is buried in the ground. Then, and then only, would Moses and Joshua and Caleb, those who had faith, be allowed to start the march toward the Promised Land. And in the long run, only Joshua and Caleb were able to enter the Promised Land. The road of faith takes us through the wilderness constantly. It's a lonely road. Joshua and Caleb walked that road. And because of that, they had to spend time here in this desert with the faithless ones. And yet, this is the road toward spiritual maturity, always leading through the wilderness. Here, God allows us to understand the circumstances, will strip us of all the things that we have. We see the meaninglessness of material possessions. And we find out that God alone can be trusted. But He can be trusted. And we make preparation for the final day when God will say, now I will show you my glory and liberate you to glory. You know, it's so easy to think that you're a grasshopper when you're standing against the knees of a giant. And yet, faith says, God is bigger than the giants of this world. In the last stanza of Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, he says, I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverge into a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. Joshua and Caleb took the road less traveled by. The others, more cautious, chose the broad way. And because of that, their bones are buried here in the sands at Kadesh, Barnea. And yet, God raised up a new generation of young Israelis who were willing to follow those men of faith. No longer did they see themselves as grasshoppers. They saw themselves for who they really were, the children of God. That's the message of faith.